Ethan had driven his best friend Ryan's mother home many times, usually after family dinners or neighborhood events. That evening, however, felt different. Margaret sat quietly beside him, watching the passing streetlights through the window. She seemed distracted, almost nervous, as though she had something important she wanted to say. They had attended Ryan's birthday dinner together, where everyone laughed, shared stories, and stayed later than expected. When Margaret mentioned feeling tired, Ethan immediately offered to drive her home. She accepted with a grateful smile. The ride began normally, filled with familiar conversation and soft music playing quietly in background. As they approached Margaret's neighborhood, she suddenly asked Ethan to slow down. He glanced toward her, wondering whether something was wrong. She looked outside at the quiet streets, then smiled sadly. "Would you mind taking one more loop?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, although he didn't understand her request yet. He turned the car around and followed the longer road through town. Margaret rested her head against the seat and watched familiar places pass by. After several minutes, she finally explained that she wasn't ready to go home. Her house felt unusually empty lately, and she needed company tonight. Ethan understood more than she expected. He knew Margaret had been dealing with loneliness since her husband passed away several years earlier. She rarely discussed it, especially around Ryan. Instead, she focused on work, family gatherings, and helping everyone else. Tonight, however, the quiet had become impossible to ignore. "Sometimes," Margaret said softly, "I wish people would ask how I'm doing instead of assuming I'm fine." Ethan glanced at her and admitted that he had made that assumption too. She smiled gently, saying she understood. She wasn't blaming him. She simply wanted someone to notice when she needed support. They continued driving without a destination. Ethan asked whether she wanted coffee, dessert, or perhaps a late-night walk somewhere peaceful. Margaret laughed and said she didn't need anything special. She only wanted the road to keep moving for a little longer. Somehow, that simple request made perfect sense. At a quiet overlook outside town, Ethan parked the car. The city lights stretched below them, scattered like tiny stars. Margaret stepped outside and breathed deeply. "I used to come here when Ryan was little," she said. "Back then, I thought I had all the time in the world." Ethan listened as she described memories of family vacations, school mornings, forgotten lunches, and Ryan's childhood jokes. Her expression softened while remembering those years. She admitted that watching her son grow up had been wonderful, but it had also left her wondering what her own future should look like. Ethan told her that growing older didn't mean life had ended. It simply meant some chapters had finished. Margaret looked at him thoughtfully and said he sounded unusually wise for someone younger than her. He laughed, explaining that difficult experiences had taught him to appreciate moments other people sometimes overlook. They stayed at the overlook for nearly 20 minutes before Margaret finally returned to the car. She seemed calmer now. Ethan started the engine, but before leaving, she thanked him for listening. He said there was nothing to thank him for. Friends were supposed to show up when someone needed them. The word friends made Margaret smile. She reminded him that he wasn't just Ryan's friend anymore. Over the years, she had come to appreciate him as his own person. Ethan admitted he felt the same way. Their connection had always been based on family familiarity, but tonight felt deeper and more honest. On the way home, Margaret became quiet again. Ethan wondered whether he had said something wrong, but she reassured him that she was simply thinking. Finally, she whispered that she was afraid of becoming invisible as everyone around her moved forward. Ethan told her she deserved to be seen and heard. When they reached her driveway, Margaret didn't immediately open the door. She looked toward her house, then back at Ethan. "Thank you for giving me another 20 minutes, she said. Ethan smiled and replied that they could take another loop whenever she needed someone to listen without judgment or pressure. Margaret laughed softly and said she might take him seriously. Then she stepped out, closed the door, and walked toward her house. Ethan watched until she reached the entrance. Before going inside, she turned around and waved. He waved back, realizing the evening had changed something between them quietly. The next morning, Ethan received a message from Margaret thanking him again. She said she had slept better than expected. Ethan replied that he was glad. She then invited him and Ryan to dinner later that week. Ethan smiled at the invitation, knowing the simple drive had meant much more to her. At dinner, Ryan noticed that his mother seemed happier. He asked what had happened, and Margaret simply said Ethan had been kind enough to listen. Ryan looked at his friend and thanked him. Ethan shrugged, saying anyone would have done the same. Margaret smiled because she knew that wasn't entirely true. Over the following months, Ethan continued checking on Margaret occasionally. Sometimes they talked over coffee, sometimes during family dinners, and sometimes while driving around town. Nothing dramatic happened. Instead, trust grew naturally through ordinary moments. Margaret became more comfortable asking for help, while Ethan learned that listening could matter enormously. Eventually, Margaret began rebuilding parts of her life she had neglected. She joined a community group, returned to painting, and planned a trip she had postponed for years. Ethan was happy to see the change. He realized that his role had never been to rescue her, but simply remind her she wasn't alone. Whenever they passed the old overlook, Margaret smiled and remembered that night. "One more loop," she would say jokingly. Ethan always laughed and turned the car around. Neither needed to explain what those words meant anymore. Sometimes, healing begins with nothing more complicated than someone willing to keep driving beside you.